So, Dr. Goldberg, come on up here because I am extremely excited to listen to your report. I've been reading a lot of Dr. Elkhonon's, Goldberg's research, and all I can say is this new image, this new knowledge that we have about how the brain actually works in a much more richly integrated model has left me actually deeply moved and keenly optimistic. So, Dr. Goldberg, please.
Well, I found the morning session very encouraging. I was born in November. In fact, November 7th, which was a very important date in Tajikistan. Mr. Znaimer left, but he would have appreciated that. And my bull mastiff Brit, who by any definition is a giant breed, has just turned 8, so he's defying expectations. Well, let me talk about what happens to the brain as we age. And of course, the mind is our most precious possession, and the loss of mind or erosion of our mind is the most tragic, most catastrophic loss. So it sort of behooves us to try to understand what's going on. I'll talk about neuroplasticity and ramifications of this currently very trendy notion. And of course, familiarity, everybody talks about neuroplasticity today, and familiarity breeds an illusion of understanding, but we don't necessarily understand what it means even when we talk about it. So I'll try to sort of to enlarge on that a little bit. Well, what happens as we age? Of course, a kind of a usual discourse about the age, and it's delightful to be here where this this usual way of talking about cognition is challenged. But the usual traditional discourse about cognitive aging is that we tend to focus on losses. People talk about memory loss, loss of this, loss of that, and indeed a number of cognitive functions measurably decline. But then there are other cognitive functions which resist the effects of aging, and certain cognitive functions even exhibit certain increment, certain improvement with age. So let's try to sort it out. Of course, the brain is a very heterogeneous organ. I'm not going to bore you with neuroanatomy, but just to show you, just look at this quilt-like depiction of the hemisphere and how diverse every patch here represents a somewhat different aspect of organization. And just I want you to appreciate how variegated the brain is. So clearly, different parts of the brain are in charge of different functions, and different parts of the brain respond to aging, to the effects of age in different ways and at different rates. So it's no longer tenable to talk about brain aging in these kind of generic terms. One has to get specific, and we will. Now, well, so when people talk about cognitive functions which tend to decline with age, particularly rapidly, we talk about the so-called executive functions, and by executive functions we mean a whole range of mental abilities. What happened to my laser pointer? Here it is. Such as planning, mental flexibility, the ability to deal with novelty. Attention tends to erode, or at least certain aspects of attention tend to erode with aging, and certain aspects of memory. But despite all these measurable unwelcome changes, students of cognitive aging have been puzzled and have appreciated a very interesting phenomenon, so-called expert paradox. So that even though somebody may reveal some cognitive declines in various respects, one's capacity to perform in one's chosen area of expertise remains intact and remains quite crisp despite aging and despite these measurable decrements. I mean, I witness it in my colleagues. With any luck, I'll be 64 in 2 weeks. I'm surrounded with colleagues and friends who may be a decade or maybe even a decade and a half older than myself. I have dinner with some of them, and basically the fact that their attention is wandering, that you tell them something, and then 10 minutes later they don't seem to remember, is inescapable. And being a neuropsychologist, I notice it. Yet these are the people. Who, many of whom continue to practice very successfully as some of the top physicians in New York up and down Park Avenue, and some of the top attorneys in New York up and down Madison Avenue. And when it comes to professional expertise, I have no hesitation picking up the phone, calling them, asking for their advice, and I invariably get a crisp, lucid, competent response, okay? So this is the paradox of aging. So the brain and the mind is not all or none. Certain aspects of the mind and of the brain may decline, yet others may be preserved. Now, to give you a very extreme example, and two extreme examples, and I talk about them in one of my books titled The Wisdom Paradox. You must have, or you may have heard the name Willem de Kooning. How many of you have? No? Willem de Kooning, one of the most celebrated painters, artists of the 20th century. Now, by a certain age, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Okay? Now, if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which reopened a few years ago after restoration, you will see in the main atrium of the museum, or at least it was there, a year or two ago when I was there, you will see a big piece by de Kooning. And if you look at the plaque, which is dated, you will, and those of you who know his biography, and I did, will notice that he was already carried this diagnosis when he painted this masterpiece, which is exhibited in arguably the most sophisticated, the most important museum of modern art in the world, okay? So to me, this is a very dramatic example of how losses may coexist with aspects of preservation. Another such example I encountered a few years ago in Spain. How many of you have heard the name Eduardo Chillida? Yeah, he's one of the greatest sculptors of the 20th century. And I had a very similar experience. I was invited by a Society of Basque Neurologists to San Sebastian, and I gave my talk, and then they treated me to dinner. And over the dinner, they were regaling me with the stories how this great sculptor was a patient of theirs at a state of advanced dementia. Now, the next day, they took me to Chillida's sculpture garden in the suburbs of San Sebastian, and he was known for these monumental sculptures, the kind of stuff that is exhibited in city squares, not in apartments. And I am wandering around, I am looking at the plaques, and again, I do the kind of the math in my head, examining the chronology, and conclude that he had to already have been afflicted by this disease, at least to some extent, at the time when he was creating these monumental sculptures which are exhibited in some of the most prestigious museums of the world. So these are two very dramatic examples. And this is, to me, they encapsulate this paradox of aging, which on a more mundane level, I notice in my doctor and lawyer friends who are not as famous of these two characters, but who are, established professionals, experts in their field. Now, well, how do we understand that? In order to understand it, one needs to examine a notion which we call neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to restore itself, to regenerate itself, and it consists of various components, so-called synaptogenesis, angiogenesis, gliogenesis, which reflect the ability of the brain to generate its various components, various moving parts. And what's particularly intriguing is the capacity of an adult brain for so-called neurogenesis, and that is something which until about 2 decades ago was regarded impossible. In fact, Nobel Prize was given to a great Spanish neuroanatomist, Ramon y Cajal, about 100 years ago for declaring that neurogenesis was impossible, okay? And now we're finding out that it is possible. And this is the ability of neurons to actually be regenerated in the brain through the whole lifespan. It used to be thought that this ability is lost by the age of 2 or 3. Now we believe that the brain retain this ability through the lifespan. And furthermore, we are finding out that neuroplasticity is impacted by the nature and by the extent of our mental activities, okay? So as I sort of tried to impress on you earlier, the brain is highly heterogeneous. Different parts of the brain are in charge of different mental functions. And depending on which mental functions we exercise through various activities, this will benefit the underlying parts of the brain. Okay, now, and we have plenty of evidence of this effect. I don't expect you to read this illegible slide, but we know that the parts of the brain in charge of spatial memory is particularly large in those professions where spatial memory is exercised. We know that parts of the brain in charge of certain aspects of language are particularly large in bilingual individuals compared to monolingual individuals. We know that the part of the brain in charge of tonal discrimination is particularly large in musicians, etc., etc. And there is some way of demonstrating the direct of causation here is from activity to anatomy and not the other way around. I will not dwell on that. It'll take more time than I have, but we have a way of demonstrating it. Now, well, so what does that mean? That means this message contains a good news and it contains a bad news, okay? An alarming news. The good news is that the neuroplasticity benefits those parts of the brain which we continue to engage through our lifespan. The flip side of that is that those parts of the brain which we do not engage through our lifespan fail to benefit from the effects of neuroplasticity. And the consequences of that are quite dramatic, and my own research has demonstrated it, and we will talk about it a little bit briefly in the remaining 5.5 minutes that I have. Now, we know that the part of the brain which succumbs to the effect of aging, and when I mean effects of aging, I mean the extent of atrophy, age-associated atrophy in normal aging. There are several such parts of the brain. Conspicuous among them is the so-called prefrontal cortex. I'm pointing at my own head, something located right here. Okay, this part of the brain is known to succumb to aging more rapidly than other parts of the brain. In fact, it's depicted on this slide, also from one of my earlier books. Here, the darker the shading, the more rapid the age-associated atrophy in those parts of the brain, and you see that this prefrontal cortex is the darkest. Okay, well, what do we know about the prefrontal cortex? We know, and I talk about it in one of my books titled The Executive Brain. And let's skip this frivolous slide. And I talk about it in a more recent book of mine, The New Executive Brain, which I think you have on this display over there, which came out about a year ago. Now, well, what do we know about the frontal lobes? We know that they are particularly important for dealing with cognitive novelty. And before we examine this proposition, let me digress and submit to you something which is not even a neuroscientific conclusion, but is kind of a common sense observation. Unless, as we age, our exposure to novelty usually shrinks. I think you will agree with me that unless you are transported to the moon, or unless you morph into a dolphin, in other words, unless your life changes in some very dramatic, precipitous ways, as one ages, the domain of the familiar expands and the domain of the novel shrinks, and we begin to, and our world is increasingly run by familiar routines. Would you agree with that general proposition or not? Yeah? Well, what does that mean? That means that as we age, we engage those parts of the brain which deal with cognitive novelty less and less and less. Okay? Now, so what I'm going to show you in the few minutes remaining is that these are precisely the parts of the brain which succumb to the effects of aging more rapidly than other parts of the brain. And frontal lobes is one such part of the brain. This is a study using so-called functional magnetic resonance imaging, some of the earlier work of ours conducted in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Kai Fogelei, where we examined brain engagement in a task which is presented to a subject and starts out as a novel cognitive task, but then in the course of the experiment it becomes familiar. And so you see that while the task is novel, you see you have the activation in the frontal lobes. As the task becomes familiar, activation in other parts of the brain is present, but the frontal activation disappears, okay? So prefrontal cortex is particularly important on those stages when the task is novel. And this is another demonstration of the same fact, basically, using a different methodology, using electroencephalography, using at various aspects of EEG, so-called gamma frequency, 30 to 40 hertz frequency, which is known to be associated with strenuous thinking, okay? So it can be used as a marker of cognitive engagement. Again, a similar situation. This is a natural history of a cognitive task, so that the subject, these are normal people who are presented with a novel cognitive task, and then in the course of an experiment which lasts maybe 40, 50 minutes, the task becomes familiar. And what you see here is how at early stages frontal lobes are engaged, and then they are no longer engaged as the task becomes familiar, okay? So this is a demonstration of this preferential relationship, privilege relationship between the cognitive novelty and the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes are the ones which seem to succumb to the effects of aging more rapidly than other parts of the brain. Now, another interesting fact, which is depicted on this second illegible slide, but I'll explain it to you, is that the two hemispheres, and of course we know that the brain consists of two hemispheres, age at different rates. The right hemisphere ages, and again by aging I mean atrophy, ages more rapidly than the left hemisphere. And again, there is a body of research, I describe it in this book, a body of research which we will sort of have to forego here, but you will take my word for it. It's on these slides for which we don't have time. The right hemisphere is particularly critical for dealing with cognitive novelty, where the left hemisphere deals with cognitive routines. So what did we find out? We found out that those parts of the brain which are particularly critical for dealing with novel information also are the ones which succumb to the effects of aging more rapidly. Well, that's the bad news. So the bottom line is that one should continue to challenge and engage the brain and constantly expose oneself to novel situations despite the seductive value of mental autopilots. And of course, this is the mantra which is being repeated over and over again. But I think that I provided sort of a modicum of scientific support for this mantra, constantly exposing oneself to novelty is easier said than done. We all know rhetorically that it should be done, but I think Thomas Edison said that most human being would go to any length to escape the hard work of thinking. That is kind of a nihilistic statement attributed to him, and we all are like that. Mental autopilot are seductive, but they are not good for our brain. And I know that I am ahead of my over my time limit, but I will indulge myself for just another 30 seconds. As the previous speaker said, this knowledge that neuroplasticity, in fact, is a very powerful tool for maintaining brain longevity, now has been parlayed and is being parlayed into a whole kind of a movement of cognitive fitness, with various devices and various software packages being offered. And as Dr. Eichmann said, the specific utility of these individual packages has yet to be demonstrated, but the whole principle, the whole concept is being increasingly embraced of cognitive fitness, being increasingly embraced. This is my dog, the Brit, who just turned 8 years of age, even though actuarially he's supposed to live till 6, okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, please stick around. I'd like to chat with you over the lunch.